In 2011, the White Stripes vanished. At what felt like the peak of their power, they just stopped. There was no farewell tour, no last big emotional album, just a quiet announcement on their website. It was a shock. The official reason pointed to preserving the band's legacy, but the story that everyone knew was Meg White's struggle with acute anxiety. For a band that built its entire world on secrets and myths, a brother and a sister who were actually a divorced couple, the end just felt like another layer to their incredible story. Their farewell announcement talked about keeping the music pure, but it left fans with a huge lingering question. What really happened to the White Stripes? How did a band that looks so simple, just one guitar and a drum kit, have such a complicated and ultimately fragile history? Today, because you guys requested it, let's talk about the history of the White Stripes. Before we get started, be sure to hit subscribe and turn all notifications on. I hear from a lot of my subscribers that my videos don't show up in their feeds or they find themselves unsubscribed from my channel. I greatly appreciate it. The story of the band starts long before the global superstardom. In the early 1990s in Detroit, it was a city of echoes. The auto industry had faded, leaving behind this gritty industrial landscape. But in that emptiness, a raw DIY garage rock scene was exploding in dive bars and basements. It was all about reverence for old school blues and 60s punk, and it was in that world that the White Stripes began. The man who would become Jack White was originally known as John Gillis. He was the youngest of 10 kids. Growing up in southwest Detroit, his mother and father both worked for the Catholic Church in downtown in the same building. His dad was a maintenance man, and his mom was the cardinal's secretary. At the age of 10, Jack appeared in the Donald Sutherland and Charles Durning film, The Rosary Murders. Part of the film was actually filmed in Jack's church, and they had recruited a bunch of the altar boys to be in one of the scenes. At one point, Jack was seriously considering the priesthood, and he even at one point considered joining the Marines, but he had another calling, which was music. It was at the age of 5 he started playing drums, and he soon met his childhood friend, bassist Dominic Suchta, in the 5th grade. But the pair never really fit in at school, and they weren't really into the same kinds of things other kids were, like going to school dances. So instead, Jack and Dominic would bike to nearby music stores and music shops in Dearborn, Michigan, and get albums by The Who, Led Zeppelin, Bob Dylan, as well as Detroit artists like the Stooges and the MC5. It wasn't long after they started making their own crude 4-track recordings, mostly doing Bob Dylan covers. After graduating, Jack worked as an assistant on TV car commercial shoots. It was this job as a gopher on commercial sets that taught him a valuable lesson. He told Rolling Stone, "I could see that it was impossible to get your ideas across with all the people, the sound man, lighting people, producers, that you had to go through. I suppose that put me in the direction of a two-piece band." It was by 1992, while attending Castech High School as a business major, Jack got a job as an upholsterer at a local shop called Muldoon Studios. The owner was a family friend and was also a hobby drummer. The pair soon started a band with Jack's bassist friend Dominic. Dominic, however, soon moved away for college going to East Lansing, so Jack and his boss shrunk down to a two-piece, and they played together from 1993 to 1996. His boss was instrumental in introducing him to new music, with Jack recalling, "When I worked in Brian's shop, he started playing me all kinds of music like the Cramps and the Velvet Underground." The pair called themselves the Upholsters and even put out a single record. It was at some point during this time Jack also opened his own upholstery studio called Third Man Upholstery with a strict yellow and black color scheme. He once told an interviewer, "If it's not done with old tools, it doesn't feel right." This philosophy would become the bedrock of the White Stripes. Across town was Megan, or Meg White. Friends described her as shy and reserved. She was working as a bartender at a place called Memphis Smoke when she met John Gillis. The connection was immediate. They were total opposites. He was the ambitious, talkative force of nature, and she was quiet, reserved, and observant. They fell in love, and on September 21st, 1996, they got married. In a move that was pretty unconventional, John Gillis took his wife's last name and he became Jack White. It was in 1997 a new group of rock bands was taking over Detroit, garage rock groups that were led by the band Rocket 455. Jack was occupying his time with several groups including Goober and the Peas and the Henchmen and a country-infused group called Two Star Tabernacle. The White Stripes itself was almost born by accident. One day in 1997, Jack was in the attic playing guitar and he heard a beat. It was Meg, who sat behind a drum kit for the first time and just started playing. For Jack, it was a revelation. He'd played with technically amazing drummers, but this was something else. Meg's playing was primal, simple, and what he would later call liberating. It was the anchor he didn't even know he was looking for. That day, the vision for the project clicked into place. A band stripped down to its very essence. One guitar, one voice, and that powerful, primitive drum beat. He called it the White Stripes, a name that brought to mind peppermints and childhood, a perfect contrast to the raw bluesy sound. Their first gig was on Bastille Day on August 14, 1997, at an open mic night at Detroit's Gold Dollar Bar. They played 3 songs, and the reaction wasn't instant fame, but rather intrigue. They were just so different. From the very beginning, their look was as important as their sound. Everything was red, white, and black. Their clothes, their gear, their album art, it was a whole world they were building. And from the start, the pair stood out. One of their early champions was a disc jockey from Detroit station WDET named Willie Wilson. He remarked, "It was fun at the first shows, being one of 20 or so people there. It was really sloppy and stripped down because Meg couldn't really play, but it was fun and interesting." There was something unique there because you could tell the songs that Jack was doing stood out. But it took a little while for the pair to catch on in Detroit, with some concert attendees complaining about Jack's high-pitched whining vocals, but he slowly started winning them over with his songwriting. But the most important piece of their mythology was a story they told everyone. They weren't a married couple. They were brother and sister. This wasn't just a gimmick, it was a strategic choice. Jack believed that if people knew they were married, the focus would shift from the music to their relationship. The sibling myth, he thought, forced the audience to engage with the music on its own terms, creating this sense of mystery that was just captivating. So the question has to be asked, where's the bass? Well, Jack responded telling Rolling Stone, "I can see that I was in high school when I first heard the flat duo Jets. They were a guitar drums band, and I thought the same thing. Then within months, they became my favorite band. Some kind of rawness hit me, and I saw there was no need for anything else." The White Stripes spent their early years in the sweaty clubs of Detroit, signing with the local indie label Italy Records. Their first single, Let's Shake Hands, came out in 1998, followed by Lafayette Blues. These releases were raw, explosive, and steeped in the Delta blues and garage rock that Jack idolized. It wasn't long after the White Stripes signed to label Sympathy for the recording industry. By 1999, the White Stripes dropped their self-titled album, and it was a lo-fi masterpiece, a perfect snapshot of their early sound that made them a formidable force in the underground. Some of these songs actually harken back to the early 90s when Jack was playing in the two-piece band with his boss. They soon hit the road with indie rockers Pavement and Sleater Kinney. By this point, Jack and Meg's marriage was over. They quietly divorced in March of 2000, but the band remarkably kept going. Their creative partnership almost seemed to get stronger. Later that year, they released their second album, De Style, the title Dutch for the Style. It was a nod to the art movement focused on minimalism, a perfect fit for them. It was a more confident record and showed their songwriting was growing. Now, thanks to the popularity of hometown musicians like Kid Rock and Eminem, there was a lot of focus on Detroit, and the White Stripes benefited from that attention. But the band did deal with 2 headaches related to the album. One was a lawsuit filed by former Canadian radio host Dominique Payette. Payette filed a lawsuit in 2008 claiming the band used a short unlicensed audio clip from her Radio Canada teen call-in show at the beginning of the track Jumble Jumble. She demanded $70,000 in damages and requested that the album be removed from store shelves because of the inclusion of the child's voice violated Quebec's privacy statute, which has strict rules around recording and broadcasting children's voices without parental consent. The case was eventually settled out of court. Additionally, there was a separate lawsuit filed by producer Jim Diamond over royalties related to both the White Stripes' first album and De Style. However, a federal jury ruled in favor of the band, stating that Diamond was not entitled to share in royalties for his work as an engineer and mixer. But it was their third album, 2001's White Blood Cells, that blew them out of the Detroit underground and onto the world stage. Stuart Spikes, who worked with the band on the record in Memphis, recalled, "Jack knew what he wanted. Meg didn't think we should be recording. The songs were too new. It was a cleaner, more melodic record, but it still had that raw energy. And on the album was a song that would change everything. Fell in Love with a Girl." The song is 1 minute and 50 seconds of pure punk rock joy. But what really launched it into the stratosphere was its music video. Directed by visionary Michael Gondry, the video was a breathtaking stop-motion masterpiece made entirely of Lego bricks. It was so playful and creative, and on an MTV full of glossy, big-budget videos, it was impossible to ignore. The song peaked at number 12 in the States on the alternative chart and number 21 in the UK. Suddenly, the White Stripes were everywhere. They became the king and queen of the early 2000s garage rock revival, alongside groups like The Strokes and The Hives. White Blood Cells was hailed as a modern classic, and it also featured the charming country-tinged acoustic song Hotel Yorba, which became a huge fan favorite. Meanwhile, the album produced another notable single in Dead Leaves in the Dirty Ground, which peaked at number 19 and 25 on the alternative chart in the States and in the UK. While many of their contemporaries drew inspiration from the gritty cool of the 1970s New York scene, the duo looked much deeper into the past, channeling elements of Dust Bowl-era folk, Delta blues, surf rock, and rockabilly. But perhaps nowhere was their popularity greater than in the UK in the summer of 2001. They appeared at award shows, they were featured on magazine and newspaper covers, and they won awards for Fell in Love with a Girl's music video. It was radio DJ John Peel who famously introduced the band to the UK. He referred to the White Stripes as the most exciting thing since Jimi Hendrix. New Musical Express called them rock and roll born again, nothing short of a punk rock miracle. Jack remarked about this time, telling the Associated Press, "When we first went over there, we had no manager, no press agent, no record label. We just thought we were going to play a few shows and get to vacation in England, and it just exploded." The band soon nabbed a recording contract in the UK with label XL Recordings, reportedly signing a $1 million deal. And it was at the same time the White Stripes turned down a $1 million offer from The Gap to license one of their songs. On the US front, the band signed to V2 Recordings, and Jack was pretty blunt about what he wanted to get out of a bigger recording contract, admitting, "I told him I didn't want money. I didn't want big advances. I wanted complete artistic freedom. Nobody is going to tell me what songs are going to be on an album and what should or shouldn't be on the cover. Also, I never wanted to owe anybody any money, and we don't. Our albums are made so cheaply that we recoup the day it comes out." White Blood Cells ended up going platinum in the States and in the UK, with it ultimately peaking at number 61 on the Hot 100 chart. Some critics pointed to the White Stripes' minimalism as a rejection of bloated corporate rock, but as Jack saw it, if we had 5 people on stage, all the opportunity of a 300-track studio, the creativity would be dead. Too much opportunity would make it dead. With all this fame, though, came some intense scrutiny. Journalists and fans started digging, and it didn't take long for the brother-sister story to fall apart. People found their marriage certificate and their divorce papers online. The myth was busted. The media went into a frenzy. Were the White Stripes liars? Jack got defensive in interviews, arguing that the truth was less interesting than the story he had created, and he'd wanted the focus to be on the music, and now it was on his private life, exactly what he tried to avoid. He told Rolling Stone, "I saw a review of our new album and it said every single component of the White Stripes is a gigantic lie. What does that mean? Have I sat down and said I was born in Mississippi? No. Did I say I grew up on a plantation and learned how to play guitar from a blind man? I never said anything like that. It's funny that people think me and Meg sit up late at night in front of a gas lamp and come up with these intricate lies to trick people." But ironically, the expose only made their mystique deeper. The fact that this raw, powerful music was being made by a divorced couple pretending to be siblings added this incredible layer of psychological tension. The dynamic on stage, Jack, the frenetic frontman, and Meg, the stoic silent powerhouse, was now seen through this whole new complicated lens. The lie had accidentally turned the White Stripes into the most compelling soap opera in rock and roll. The band's newfound success also came at a price with some of their longtime fans. Jack admitted, "We were everybody's secret band. Then our second album came out and it was, oh, they're not that good anymore. When we hit the mainstream, I had to go through the game all over again on a worldwide scale." By 2003, the White Stripes were one of the most promising rock bands in the world. The pressure was on to follow up White Blood Cells. It was while out on the road promoting the album that the pair retreated to London's Torag Studios, a place with equipment no older than 1963. Several weeks later, and almost $10,000 spent, the band had completed 12 of 13 songs that would make up their follow-up record, Elephant. But they sat on the record for almost a year. The year they sat on the record allowed the White Stripes to build even further buzz as they played huge festivals in Europe and they made numerous TV appearances. It set the stage for what many consider to be the pinnacle of their career, 2003's Elephant. To further emphasize how different the band was from their contemporaries, they wrote in the liner notes, "No computers were used during the writing, recording, mixing, or mastering of this album. Jack, who self-produced the album, added, "If we can't produce something that sounds good under those conditions, then it's not real to begin with. Getting involved with computers is getting involved with excess, especially when you start changing drum beats to make them perfect or make the vocal melody completely in tune with some program. It's so far away from honesty." One of the songs found on Elephant, you know where I'm going with this, that riff. It started as a soundcheck doodle, a simple line played on a semi-acoustic guitar with a pitch-shifting pedal to make it sound like a bass. That riff became Seven Nation Army. The song is a perfect balance between tension and release. It builds that iconic brooding line and Meg's steady marching beat before exploding into that massive chorus. Jack has said the song was about the pressures of fame, about feeling like an army was marching against you. Whatever its origin, it became more than just a song. It became a global hit. It was adopted by sports fans. It was chanted in soccer stadiums from Milan to Munich. It became a modern folk song. Seven Nation Army was issued in February of 2003, and it was the first single from the album. The single became the first song from the so-called garage rock revival to top the alternative charts in America. And that ain't what you want to hear, but that's what I'll do. It peaked at number 12 on the mainstream rock tracks chart and was a crossover hit, peaking at number 76 on the Hot 100. It was a song that took the White Stripes from a garage rock act to worldwide fame. But Elephant was way more than just one hit. It was packed with classics, like The Hardest Button to Button came with another brilliant Michael Gondry video. The song peaked at number 8 on the American alternative chart. There was the 7-minute blues epic Ball and Biscuit with some of Jack's most incredible guitar work. And then there was the quiet Vulnerable in The Cold Cold Night, a rare track with Meg on lead vocals, her gentle voice a stark contrast to Jack's usual swagger. I hear the creaking of the kitchen floor. Another single, I Just Don't Know What to Do With Myself, ended up peaking at number 25 on the alternative airplay chart. And the track Little Acorns ended up featuring local Detroit television and commentator Mort Krim.
She worked her way out of despondency, and now she says life is good again.
The album was a huge success, peaking at number 6 in the States, and it ultimately went gold in just 2 months, eventually going double platinum, winning the Grammy for Best Alternative Music Album. The White Stripes were headlining festivals, playing arenas, and the dynamic was more pronounced than ever. Jack channeling a century of American music, and Meg the enigma. She rarely gave interviews. On stage, she was a bastion of stoicism, providing the heavy hypnotic pulse that was the band's heartbeat. Some critics called her drumming amateurish, but they were missing the point. Her simplicity was her power. She played with feel and not technique. She was the anchor that kept the whole thing grounded. Without her, there was no White Stripes. And Meg's simple drumming was something Jack was frequently asked about in the press. He largely blamed any criticism on sexism, adding, "Meg is the best part of the band. It never would have worked with anybody else because it would have been too complicated." But as their fame got bigger, the pressure of being that silent anchor was starting to take its toll. After the triumph of Elephant, the White Stripes did what they always did. They took a sharp left turn with their follow-up 2005's Get Behind Me, Satan. The album stands as their most daring effort, blending the White Stripes' fast-paced rock energy with Jack's deep love for old-school blues and country. It's steeped in a dark roadhouse mood, brought to life by grand piano flourishes and marimba textures. It was theatrical, weird, and brilliant. The lead single, Blue Orchid, with its fuzzed-out riff and Jack's piercing falsetto, signaled a whole new direction. Blue Orchid peaked at number 7 on the alternative airplay and number 32 on the mainstream rock tracks chart. And it was a crossover hit, peaking at number 43 on the Hot 100. The album was polarizing, but critics ultimately praised its audacity, and it won them another Grammy. The album produced 2 other singles, In My Doorbell and The Denial Twist, which peaked at number 13 and 5 on the alternative chart. The album, meanwhile, peaked at number 3 in the States, went gold, and went platinum in the UK. But behind the scenes, the constant touring was wearing on them, especially Meg. She was a naturally private person who had been thrown into the global spotlight. While Jack seemed to thrive on the energy, Meg found it draining. Her silent drummer persona wasn't just an act, it was a reflection of how uncomfortable she was with fame. In 2007, the White Stripes came back with what would ultimately be their final album, Icky Thump. It was a thunderous return to form, bringing back the heavy blues rock riffs, but with a new level of sophistication. The title track was a snarling take on immigration sentiment and became one of their biggest hits, topping the alternative chart and peaking at number 11 on the mainstream rock tracks chart. And also it was a crossover hit, peaking at number 26 on the Hot 100. The album, meanwhile, was a massive success, debuting at number 2 on the Billboard chart, and it eventually went gold. They launched a huge tour, and it really felt like they were at the absolute top of their game. And then it just all stopped. In September of 2007, the band canceled all of their remaining tour dates. The official statement was quite direct. Meg White is suffering from acute anxiety and is unable to travel at this time. This was the first public confirmation of the struggle happening behind the scenes. The relentless cycle had just become too much for Meg. For the first time, the future of the band felt completely uncertain. The years after the tour cancellation were mostly silent. The White Stripes didn't break up right away, they just went on an indefinite hiatus. But then in early 2009, the White Stripes made their final appearance, performing the song We're Going to Be Friends on Conan O'Brien's final late night show, prior to him taking over Jay Leno's Tonight Show. Little did fans know that they were witnessing history at the time. As Jack did press around 2009, he revealed in interviews that the White Stripes were working on new music and he hoped to release a new record someday. Jack, being the workaholic he is, though, immediately dove into other projects as well. He formed the Raconteurs and then the darker, more psychedelic The Dead Weather. In 2009, he opened his own record store and label, Third Man Records, in Nashville, a temple to his love for all things analog. He was busier than ever, but the White Stripes remained a question mark. Meg, in stark contrast, retreated from public life completely. She had married musician Jackson Smith in 2009 in a ceremony in Jack's backyard in Nashville, but they would split in 2013. She moved away and disappeared from the spotlight she never wanted. Her silence was as powerful as her drumming had been. Then on February 2nd, 2011, the final announcement came. A simple, heartfelt post on their website confirmed it. The White Stripes were no more. They didn't cite creative differences or bad blood. The reason, they said, was to preserve what is beautiful and special about the band. Then in 2014, Jack gave an interview to Rolling Stone where he admitted he was no longer on speaking terms with Meg, stating, "I don't think anyone talks to Meg. She's always been a hermit." It was a graceful end to one of the most important bands of a generation. In an era of digital perfection, they were a blast of raw analog truth. Their legacy is undeniable. It lives on every time a stadium or people chant the riff to Seven Nation Army. It lives on in Jack White's celebrated solo career. And it lives on in the mystery of Meg White, a reluctant icon who proved that power doesn't always have to be loud. In April of 2025, their status was cemented with their induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The story of the White Stripes is a story of contradictions. A divorced couple who played siblings, a minimalist that created maximalist sound, and a shy drummer who became the heartbeat of a global band. The myth they built was so powerful that in the end, it became their reality. They were a band built on a beautiful, fragile secret, and they had the wisdom to let it go before it broke, preserving it forever in the grooves of their records. That brings us to the end of today's video, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again on Rock Roll True Story. Sticker.